Michael, thank you so much for joining us. Straight away, we want to get into this latest skirmish on the disputed Himalayan border between the Indian soldiers and Chinese troops. For someone who doesn't follow this necessarily, they would ask the question, why were there no bullets fired, but we still had like a number of casualties?
Well, it's quite surprising. I mean, even for those that have studied the relationship between China and India over the years, what happened in the last 48 hours is extremely surprising. China and India have had a disputed border for a number of years. They fought a war over it in the 1960s. It hasn't been resolved. There have been a number of border standoffs in recent years, the most recent one in 2017. But in all those cases, you really didn't have high levels of violence. The most you would have in most cases over the last few decades was, soldiers pushing each other around, shoving each other, punching each other, some brawls that took place, but no heavy violence. There had been no exchange. There has been no exchange of fire over the disputed border for a number of decades.
We saw several reports. Basically, both sides are kind of saying that there was a provocation from the either side, right? Also, the situation has been fuzzy because it's higher up in the mountains and we don't have anecdotal reference of what's going on. So what is this change of status quo? Is it from the India side or from the Chinese side?
Well, that's the $500 million question. As you say, from the start, I mean, over the last few months, it's been unclear as to what exactly has happened. And of course, each side's government has suggested that the other was the one that engaged in the provocations. And I think part of the problem is that this is a disputed border that's a very long border. And at many points along this disputed border, there's disagreements between the two sides as to where the line of demarcation actually takes place. So, and that means that, Chinese troops can step into an area that they believe is their territory, and yet India could think the opposite, and vice versa.
Also, Michael, it comes at an interesting time when it comes. Last week, Nepal passed this law basically redrawing its borders. So there's been something of an issue for India, right? Given that Nepal and India relationships have been very strong in the past, and then we know that India-Pakistan relationship, at least on the border, the border is really hard, the LOC, right? And then with Bangladesh, there is this issue of Rohingyas or the migrants. So do you think there are a lot of fronts that India may have opened in the last couple of months?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, India is under a lot of pressure in its own neighborhood, which I think is problematic for New Delhi for a number of reasons. One being that one of the Modi government's signature foreign policies is what it describes as its good neighbor policy, which is basically meant to shore up relations with its smaller neighbors, and setting aside Pakistan, which is a separate problem. But what we've seen instead is that India has found itself sparring with some of what had been its closest friends in the neighborhood, such as Nepal, as you mentioned. There's a border spat there. And separately, India has problems with Bangladesh. That's because of some of the domestic policies that India has come out with, including a new citizenship law, which is controversial because many believe that it discriminates against Muslims.
What happened in August last year when India revoked Article 370 of the Indian Constitution, basically taking away the autonomy in Kashmir. Has anything what happened in the last 24 hours to do with what happened in August in Kashmir last year?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think one of the enduring questions about this latest spat is what motivated China, and why did it do these provocations when it did? Certainly, I think any conversation about Chinese motivations for its provocations in this latest border spat must address the Article 370 repeal, just because China responded very quickly and very forcefully after India made that move. I mean, the very day after it was made, August 6, 2019, you had a very strongly worded Chinese foreign ministry statement. And, China sees the Article 370 repeal similarly to how Pakistan sees it. And that's India effectively acting unilaterally to formally take or formally incorporate onto its territory an area that China claims in part. So, I think it's quite certain that this issue figured in China's thinking. I would not argue, as some, particularly in Pakistan, have argued, that it was the sole motivation. There were a lot of factors at play. China has been uncomfortable about Indian infrastructure building on its side of the disputed border, including the completion of a very large road stretching from the capital of Ladakh, Leh, all the way to the Karakoram Pass. That worries China because of what it could mean for India's ability to project power across Ladakh. I think you also have to look at the fact that the U.S.-India relationship has been growing very robustly, even as the U.S.-China relationship has really been struggling. So I imagine that China wanted to send a message to both New Delhi and Washington with these provocations. And finally, the coronavirus pandemic has put China on the defensive in the sense that many countries, the U.S. but many others, have been very critical of China for how it initially handled the pandemic. So I think with China on the defensive, in the court of global public opinion, it felt a need to go on the offensive to prove its nettle and its toughness and its resolve. So I think that those are other factors that we have to consider.
I guess another important question that some analysts would be like very keen to be answered is like, how is Pakistan looking at all this? Given we know that, you know, in Pakistan and China call each other, like at least Pakistan does, all weather or all season friends. What do you do? How is Pakistan looking at this?
Well, I think that Pakistan certainly derives some benefits. Just looking at a situation of India getting bogged down on its northern front, um, mired in this very serious dispute with China, Pakistan's close partner. From the zero-sum perspective, a very simplistic zero-sum perspective of India-Pakistan relations, that's a net positive for Pakistan. And particularly when you look at Pakistan's foreign policy goals, one of those goals is to try to deter India, to try to prevent it from doing things that could pose dangers and problems to Pakistan. So, with India bogged down in this border dispute, that certainly would be seen as a good thing. Also, Pakistan for ever since August 2019 has been trying to get the world to focus more on the Article 370 repeal and take Pakistan's position that it was illegal and the wrong thing to do. Hadn't really succeeded, I would argue. But now, with this spat, and especially with this deadly incident having escalated the spat, the world is talking or thinking about Article 370 and what implications it could have had geopolitically. But, I think that Pakistan in some ways is disadvantaged by this crisis. The main reason being that I think that the spat really amplifies the strength of the U.S.-India relationship. We've seen several U.S. senior leaders in Washington come out publicly in criticizing China for what's been going on. And, at the end of the day, one of the main reasons why the U.S.-India relationship has moved forward so much in recent years is shared concern about China's rise and its increasingly provocative activities in the Indo-Pacific region.
Michael, I have a last question for you. If the diplomacy doesn't work, if the reconciliatory talks do not lead to where the two countries want them to lead, what is the worst case scenario that might happen?
Well, I think the worst case scenario is that escalations would continue, that you would have more mobilizations of soldiers on both sides of the border, and that there would be more exchanges or more incidents like what we had, to the point where you have to really worry about the risk of a conflict. And I think, unlike other major border disputes around the world, I don't necessarily think there's any one country that would want to come in and mediate. It's interesting that the Russians had reportedly come in with efforts to try to mediate this dispute. I think they've now been put off for a few days. There may be something to that. But the U.S., even though I think it privately supports India in this, and it's very unhappy about what China is doing, I'm not sure the U.S. would formally put itself out there as a mediator. Maybe you could look to the United Nations. I don't know, but I think that there's a risk that if the talks don't resume again, if the conciliatory language ends, there's a risk that you could have escalation pretty far up the ladder before there's a chance for the world and for third-party mediators to get involved. So yeah, the worst case scenario is the strong risk of some type of conflict, which is the last thing that anyone needs at this point, and especially India and China.